The rain fell in an unbroken sheet, thick and relentless, turning the ground beneath their boots into sucking mud. The storm had rolled in fast, as if summoned by the events of the night, a fitting backdrop for the ghost they had caught. Sergeant Holt yanked on the prisoner's arm, dragging him forward through the filth. The man barely reacted. His bare feet sank into the mud with every step, yet he walked as if it didn't bother him, as if he belonged to the storm itself. He was silent, unflinching, and that unsettled Jensen more than the blood still drying on the man's tattered clothes. Jensen stole a glance at him, shivering as a wind cut through his uniform. The prisoner was built like something carved from sinew and survival, lean, hardened, his body a road map of scars. His tangled, shoulder-length hair dripped with rain, clinging to his face in strands. But it was his eyes that haunted Jensen the most. Pale blue, unnatural, eyes that did not belong to a man. He should have looked broken. He should have looked afraid. Instead, he looked patient. Jensen swallowed hard and turned his gaze forward. Don't think about it. Just another job. The outpost loomed ahead, a cold, iron-gated compound on the edge of Black Hollow Forest. The only thing standing between them and enemy territory. The only thing standing between them and whatever was hunting out there. The prisoner had been found just beyond the tree line, kneeling beside what had once been men. 7 bodies, all soldiers from their own ranks, ripped apart, skinned in places, eyes vacant, mouths open in frozen screams. And the man they found among them? Not a scratch on him. The squad had nearly shot him on sight. But he hadn't run, hadn't fought, hadn't said a word. Just knelt there, looking up at them as if he was the one who had discovered them. Holt shoved him harder, shaking off the unease creeping into his own bones. Move, you bastard. They reached the outpost gates, and the metal groaned as it swung inward. The place was a miserable excuse for a stronghold, mostly steel and concrete, reinforced watchtowers on the perimeter, built for war, not comfort. And waiting for them in the storm, arms crossed and expression unreadable, was Captain Lorne. She was a woman of sharp features and sharper instincts. Dark hair pulled into a tight bun, eyes that saw too much. She barely flinched as she took in the sight before her. 1 prisoner, 7 missing soldiers, and a squad that looked more rattled than they cared to admit. Holt snapped to attention, though the rain had long since ruined any sense of professionalism. We found him at the edge of Black Hollow. Just sitting there. Lorne's eyes flickered to the prisoner, scanning him the way a predator sizes up another. She took a slow step forward. The man remained motionless. Her voice was calm, but there was something cold in it. Who are you? The prisoner said nothing. Lorne tilted her head. A moment of silence passed, filled only by the rain drumming against steel. Then, without warning, she grabbed his chin, tilting his face toward the light. Jensen tensed. He half expected the prisoner to snap his teeth at her, to lunge or snarl. But he didn't. He only stared at her, as if he was measuring her. Lorne's grip tightened, her thumb brushing over an old scar running down the length of his jaw. Not one of theirs, she murmured. Not one of ours. She let go and stepped back, her mind working behind those calculating eyes. Take him to the cage. Jensen blinked. Cage! Holt grunted. Yeah, kid. Animals go in cages. Jensen swallowed but didn't argue. The cage sat in the farthest corner of the yard, rusted and barely covered by an overhang. It wasn't meant for prisoners. It was meant for rabid dogs, temporary holding for creatures too wild to be trusted among men. The squad forced the prisoner inside, locking the iron door behind him. The space was barely enough for him to stand properly, but he didn't seem to care. He sat cross-legged, rain dripping down his face, breath slow and measured. Holt banged his rifle against the bars. You understand what's happening, don't you? Nothing. Not a word. Jensen looked away, wrapping his arms around himself. As the squad dispersed, Lorne remained. She watched the prisoner in silence, standing just beyond the glow of the torchlight. The storm made the shadows dance across her face, but her expression was still unreadable. She had seen many things in this war, but something about this man unsettled even her. Finally, she spoke. No food, no questions. Let him rot. She turned on her heel and walked away. But as she stepped into the barracks, Jensen hesitated. For a long moment, he stood there in the rain, staring at the man in the cage. The prisoner had still not moved, had still not spoken, but Jensen felt something crawl up his spine as the man watched him. Not with fear, not with anger, but with something worse, with understanding, as if he already knew how this was going to end, as if he was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. The rain didn't stop. Jensen sat on his bunk, staring at the ceiling of the barracks, listening to the storm hammer against the metal roof. Most of the squad had already collapsed into restless sleep, but he couldn't. He could still see the prisoner's eyes, those pale, patient eyes, staring back at him from the cage. It had been 3 days. 3 days since they locked him up in the rusted cell at the edge of the yard. 3 days since Captain Lorne ordered that no one speak to him. No food, no warmth, just the cold and the rain. And yet, the man had not complained, had not shivered, had not begged. Jensen had seen prisoners before, men broken down by war, by hunger, by fear. They cried out for mercy, for food, for salvation. But not this one. He simply sat there, his body motionless, his gaze unwavering, as if he were waiting for something. And that made Jensen uneasy. With a sigh, he swung his legs over the side of the bunk and stood. Sleep wasn't coming anytime soon. Maybe a walk would help. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The outpost was eerily quiet at night. The rain softened into a steady drizzle, mist curling around the perimeter like ghostly fingers. The watchtowers loomed overhead, their spotlights casting long, flickering shadows across the compound. Jensen pulled his jacket tighter and walked toward the cage. He wasn't sure why he was doing this. Maybe curiosity. Maybe something else. The prisoner was still there, still sitting, still silent. For a brief moment, Jensen wondered if he was even alive. Then the man's eyes opened. Jensen froze. The pale blue irises caught the dim light of the torch nearby, making them seem almost luminescent. The prisoner didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Jensen's grip tightened on the flashlight. He wasn't sure why, but he suddenly felt like he was the one in a cage. He swallowed. "You haven't eaten in days." No response. Jensen hesitated, shifting his weight. "You're not even cold, are you?" Again, nothing. The rain dripped from the edge of the cage, creating small ripples in the mud at the prisoner's feet. And that's when Jensen saw them. The marks. His breath hitched as he took a step closer, raising his flashlight. There, along the prisoner's arms, his chest, his ribs, hundreds of tally marks. Not ink, not tattoos. Carved, deep, deliberate cuts, some old and faded, others fresh and red against the skin. Jensen's stomach twisted. He scanned them, his pulse quickening. Some had healed into thick scars, blending into the network of wounds covering the man's body. But others, he focused on the newest ones. 7 fresh cuts. Jensen's blood turned to ice. 7 was the number of men they had lost. The 7 soldiers whose bodies were torn apart in the woods. His throat went dry. He took a shaky step back. The prisoner's eyes never left him. Jensen clenched his jaw. What do they mean? Silence. His fingers trembled around the flashlight. Are they kills? Something shifted in the prisoner's expression. Not a smile. Not quite. But a small flicker of amusement. Jensen's pulse pounded in his ears. His voice came out hoarse. You did that, didn't you? For the first time, the prisoner moved. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand and ran 2 fingers along the freshest tally marks, his nails tracing the cuts with an almost reverent touch. Jensen felt sick. 7, 1 for each of the men they had lost. He stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. Goddang! The prisoner finally spoke. His voice was low, rough, like rust scraping against metal. They weren't the first. Jensen stopped breathing. The air between them was thick with something unspoken. The sound of the rain faded. The torchlight flickered. The prisoner tilted his head slightly. They won't be the last. Jensen turned on his heel and bolted. Back in the barracks, Jensen's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at his palms, trying to steady his breathing. They weren't the first. They won't be the last. He swallowed hard. Holt was snoring in the cot beside him. Across the room, a few other soldiers slept fitfully, oblivious to what Jensen had just seen. To what he knew now, the tally marks weren't random. They were a record, a ledger of death. And the prisoner, the Hound, as he had called himself, wasn't just some feral man. He was a killer, a predator. Jensen squeezed his eyes shut. He had to tell someone. Captain Lorne stood by her desk, flipping through mission reports when Jensen burst in. She looked up, arching an eyebrow. Something wrong, soldier. Jensen's pulse was racing. He struggled to find words, his throat tight with the weight of what he had just seen. The prisoner, he swallowed, his keeping count. Lorne set down the papers. Explain. Jensen took a shaky breath. The marks, the scars. He's been keeping tally of his kills. And he hesitated, feeling the weight of his next words. There's 7 new ones. The same number of men we lost. Lorne didn't react, didn't look surprised. Jensen blinked. You knew. She held his gaze. I suspected. Jensen's stomach churned. What the hell is he? Lorne sighed and leaned against the desk, crossing her arms. You ever hear the stories? She asked. Jensen hesitated. What stories? Lorne's expression darkened. There's a man they call the Hound. A ghost. A myth. A soldier who was abandoned, left for dead, and became something else. Something that doesn't stop, doesn't feel fear, doesn't die. Jensen swallowed. Lorne exhaled. Most think he's just a legend. She looked toward the window, toward the rain-soaked yard where the prisoner sat, still impatient as ever. But you and I both know better now. Jensen felt cold. What do we do? Lorne's fingers tapped against the desk. Nothing. Jensen stiffened. Nothing? That man is a monster. Is a weapon, Lorne corrected. And right now, we don't have the luxury of choosing our allies. Jensen stared at her, realization dawning like slow horror. You're going to let him out, he whispered. Lorne's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. That depends. Jensen's pulse thundered in his ears. On what? Lorne's gaze flickered to the rain-streaked window. On which way the Hound decides to hunt next. The compound was quieter than usual. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness that made the soldiers restless. Even the wind had died, as if the world was holding its breath. Jensen stood by the window of the barracks, staring at the cage in the distance. The Hound was still there, sitting cross-legged in the mud, head tilted slightly toward the sky. He hadn't moved much in the past few days, but that was what made it worse. He wasn't suffering. He wasn't growing weak. He was waiting. Jensen exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Sleep had been a stranger these past nights. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those tally marks. Those 7 fresh scars. Lorne's words still echoed in his head. Here's a weapon. Jensen didn't like what that meant. The alarm, the outpost siren shattered the silence. Jensen's heart leapt into his throat as he bolted upright. Across the barracks, soldiers scrambled out of their bunks, grabbing weapons, throwing on their gear. Holt barged in, face pale, rifle clutched tight in his hands. Perimeter breach. Jensen's stomach twisted. He didn't need to ask who had breached it. East wall, someone shouted outside. We've got movement. Jensen grabbed his gear and rushed out into the yard. The night was thick with tension, the floodlight scanning the tree line beyond the fence. The guard were on high alert, rifles trained at the darkness. Something was out there, something watching. Then came the screams. Short, sudden, cut off. Jensen's blood went cold. Then another scream, closer this time. Shit, shit, shit. Holt spat, raising his rifle as a shadow moved just beyond the fence. What the hell is out there? Jensen swallowed hard. It's not him, is it? Holt shot him a look. The Hound? No, he's still in the cage. Jensen turned his gaze back toward the rusted cell, and his stomach dropped. The cage was empty. The door was wide open. The lock untouched. Holt saw it too. Oh, fuck. The radio on his hip crackled. We've got bodies at the main gate. Someone, tore through the patrol. No gunfire, no warning, just gone. Jensen's pulse thundered in his ears. They weren't just under attack. They were being hunted. The shadow in the dark. Jensen and Holt sprinted toward the main gate, rifles raised. The floodlights flickered, barely cutting through the mist rolling in from the forest. And then they saw them, the bodies. 6 men, slaughtered, torn open like rag dolls. Their weapons lay untouched, their throats ripped clean through. No gunshots, no signs of a struggle, just silence. Jensen's hands trembled. What the hell did this? A low growl echoed from the trees. Jensen's breath hitched. It wasn't human. It wasn't him. The soldiers fell into formation, rifles aimed at the tree line. The tension was suffocating. Then, movement. A blur of something fast, too fast. A man screamed as something ripped him from the formation, dragging him into the darkness. Gunfire erupted. Muzzle flashes lit up the night. Shadows danced between the trees. But they weren't hitting anything. More screams. More bodies falling. Jensen's heart pounded. Fall back. Fall back. The squad scrambled to retreat toward the compound. Whatever was out there, it wasn't alone. Shapes moved through the mist, low to the ground, eyes reflecting the dim light. They were surrounded. Then, a whistle. Low, sharp, and everything stopped. The creatures, whatever they were, froze in place. Their glowing eyes flickered toward a single point. Jensen followed their gaze. And there he was, the hound, standing among the bodies, shirtless, rain-slick skin glistening under the lights. He held no weapon. He didn't need one. The creatures lowered themselves, muscles tense, waiting for command. The realization hit Jensen like a freight train. They weren't hunting him. They were following his orders. The deal with the devil. Captain Lorne strode out of the barracks, unarmed, her expression unreadable. She stopped a few feet from the hound. The remaining soldiers tensed behind her. Silence stretched between them. Then she spoke. You waited until we were weak. Her voice was steady. The hound didn't answer immediately. He simply studied her, then Jensen, then the remaining soldiers. Finally, he said, Not weak enough. Jensen swallowed hard. Lorne exhaled through her nose. You could have killed us already. The hound tilted his head. I still could. Jensen's fingers twitched toward his trigger. Lorne stepped closer. But you won't. A ghost of a smirk flickered across the hound's face. And why is that? Lorne's eyes narrowed. Because you need us. The wind howled through the compound. The creatures in the mist remained motionless, waiting. Lorne continued, her voice calm but firm. You've been out there long enough to know what's coming. You know the war isn't just between men and them all. Jensen's breath caught. She wasn't just talking about the enemy's soldiers. She was talking about them. The things in the forest. The things he controlled. The hound finally moved. He took a slow step forward, the creatures at his back shifting slightly, waiting for his command. War changes, he murmured. Men don't. Lorne nodded once. Then let's make a deal. Holt stiffened. Lorne didn't take her eyes off the hound. You're a predator, she said. So are they. She gestured toward the creatures lurking in the darkness. But I don't think you're loyal to them. The hound didn't answer. Lorne took another step forward. You kill our enemies, and we don't stand in your way. Her voice was steady. In return, we don't ask questions. Silence. Jensen could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Finally, the hound exhaled a slow breath. And then, he nodded. Jensen's stomach twisted. They had just made a deal with something that wasn't human. Something older. Something worse. But deep down, he knew the truth. They hadn't tamed the hound. They had simply chosen to open the gate. The wind howled through the compound as the uneasy silence settled between the soldiers and the hound. Rain slicked the mud, pooling around the lifeless bodies that littered the yard. The creatures in the mist shifted, their glowing eyes locked onto the hound, waiting for his command. Jensen swallowed hard. They had made a deal with the devil. Captain Lorne didn't blink. She stood firm in front of the hound, unarmed, unwavering. She had gambled everything on the idea that he was something they could use, something they could control. Jensen wasn't so sure. The hound tilted his head slightly, his gaze flickering between Lorne and the rest of the surviving squad. "You're afraid," he said simply, his voice a low rasp. No one answered. The truth hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Jensen clenched his rifle. "What are they?" he asked, nodding toward the shadows still lurking beyond the perimeter. The hound didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted his hand and gestured toward the tree line. The creatures moved. Slowly, they emerged from the mist, their forms becoming clearer under the floodlights. They were humanoid, but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their bodies too gaunt, their skin pale and stretched tight over their bones. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their mouths, God, their mouths, were too wide, too full of jagged teeth. Jensen's stomach twisted. They weren't men. They had never been men. The hound watched him carefully, as if measuring his reaction. "They were like you once," he said, almost casually. "Soldiers. Survivors." Jensen's blood ran cold. Something deep in his gut told him he didn't want to know more. Lorne remained composed, but Jensen could see the tension in her jaw. "You said war changes," she said. "Is this what you meant?" The hound exhaled slowly. "War leaves men behind," he murmured. "And the forgotten change." Jensen didn't realize he was gripping his rifle so tightly until his fingers ached. The creatures weren't just monsters. They had once been people. "Enough talking." Lorne's voice was sharp. "You accepted our deal. Now prove you can hold up your end." The hound's pale eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then he turned toward the mist. The creatures moved as one, vanishing into the shadows, their presence dissipating like smoke in the wind. Jensen exhaled shakily. For now, at least, they were gone. The mission, the outpost, was eerily quiet the next morning. Jensen had barely slept. None of them had. The hound remained within the compound, though no one dared go near him. He moved like a specter, silent, watchful. Even unarmed, he felt like the most dangerous thing in the entire camp. Lorne called a briefing at dawn. The surviving squad gathered in the command tent, exhaustion and unease written across their faces. Lorne stood at the center, arms crossed. The hound leaned against the wall, separate from the rest of them, as if he didn't quite belong. Jensen wasn't sure where he belonged. Lorne cleared her throat. "The enemy's next supply convoy moves through the valley in 2 days," she said. "They have reinforcements, armor, air support." Her expression darkened. "It's an impossible target. We wouldn't survive a direct assault." Jensen frowned. "So what's the plan?" Lorne glanced at the hound. "We let him go first." The room fell silent. Jensen felt a chill creep up his spine. "You're serious?" Lorne nodded. "If he's as dangerous as I think he is, then we have a chance to win this war before it ever reaches the cities." Jensen glanced at the hound. He hadn't reacted at all. Lorne turned to him. "Can you do it?" The hound smiled faintly. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "I can," he said, "but you won't want to see it." Lorne's jaw tightened. "We don't have the luxury of looking away." The hound held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. The deal was sealed. The massacre. They moved at dusk. Jensen rode in the lead transport with Holt, gripping his rifle, his heart pounding. The convoy had taken the bait. They had no idea what was coming. Jensen glanced out the window. The hound was already gone, vanishing into the trees like a ghost. Then the screaming began. It started suddenly, sharp, panic cries cutting through the valley. The convoy's headlights flickered as gunfire erupted, but it didn't last long. One by one, the lights dimmed. The gunfire slowed. The screams turned from battle cries to something else. Something primal. Jensen swallowed hard. He wanted to see what was happening, but he also didn't. By the time they reached the wreckage, it was over. Bodies lay scattered across the road, torn apart in ways that made Jensen's stomach turn. Vehicles were overturned, some still smoldering. Not a single survivor. The hound stood at the center of it all, bathed in crimson, his breathing slow and steady. Jensen had seen men killed before. But this wasn't war. This was slaughter. The hound met his gaze. "Do you still doubt me?" Jensen clenched his jaw. No, he had his proof. The hound wasn't just a weapon. He was a force of nature. And now, he was on their side. The price of a monster. The war changed after that night. The enemy began to retreat, rumors spreading of something unnatural hunting them in the dark. Soldiers abandoned their posts. Convoys vanished. The hound never spoke of what he did. Jensen never asked. But the tally marks on his skin grew. One by one, Jensen knew the truth now. They hadn't won. They had just unleashed something far worse than war itself. And one day, they would have to ask themselves a question. What happens when the hound runs out of enemies? Jensen wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer.